Hi, I'm James Tippy, and I'm a certified ethical hacker. And I'd love to take just a moment here to talk to you about um, what a system hacking is, and how that works. So, system hacking is the accessing of a system through a hacking method, right? So hacking comes in different forms, but it's gaining access to a system other than sitting down with the username and password and logging in. That's the idea behind system hacking. And so this can be done through vulnerability exploiting. This can be done through brute forcing of credentials. This can be done through lots of different methods, but the goal is to gain access to a system that you do not have a username and password for. Now, of course, as an ethical hacker, we do this with permission of the system owner. We don't go out and just hack for the fun of hacking. We make sure we're doing it ethically and with appropriate permissions. Yeah, so the rapid expansion of devices, IoT, cloud, this always changing landscape is part of what we're always talking about with my students, part of what I'm always considering, right? How does this begin to look like? How does this change what we're doing? And in some ways, it doesn't when you're coming to system hacking because your goal is to gain access to the systems you've been asked to try to access. In other ways, it radically changes it because the system now has a different definition. We're not talking someone's laptop, someone's desktop. We're not talking a physical server somewhere. We're now talking this wide variety of devices, from IoT devices and all that that encompasses, to cloud and all that that encompasses. And so you're now doing things with lots of different devices. And then we compile that with the fact that when we put it in the cloud, what permissions do we have to even try to access these systems, and who do we need to get permissions from, and what does the system even look like? And so it certainly begins to change some of the landscape of system hacking. IoT, when you look at hacking IoT, some IoT has made it much easier because sometimes cheap IoT devices haven't put the money and resources into security, because the goal being to get a device out and get it out cheap to the consumers, and security gets left out. And so it's become easier to hack sometimes and have vulnerabilities that are easier to exploit. Where if you look at cloud sometimes you don't have permissions to try to hack into it because we don't want to impact that multi-tenant environment in a negative way. And so it restricts what you're able to do in trying to access cloud. And so as this landscape though continues to evolve and change, so does what we as ethical hackers and my students as future ethical hackers need to learn, needs to evolve and change. And so I'm always looking at what is next. What do I need to know now, and what do my students need to know next, so we can begin to teach them. And cloud and IoT are big elements as we look at ethical hacking and pen testing now and into the next few years as we begin to develop and build those skills. Yeah, we've encountered, as I've worked with my students in various things, we begin to encounter that some IoT devices are inherently less secure than others. When we look at modern operating systems on desktops or laptops or servers, many of those distributors of those OSs, Windows, Apple, Linux, have begun to realize the value and importance of security and are raising their base standards of security, at least as far as they can. Now, they can't do much about people's choices of passwords and other poor choices of not patching and whatnot. But our typical OSs have been increasing security over the years and are doing a much better job. When we start to look at some IoT devices, and not all, but some IoT devices in particular, lower end, cheaper IoT devices that haven't put the money into developing the security around their system or putting the money into the technology to be able to secure their system. Sometimes those have a much lower threshold to get into, and ways of hacking that no longer work in a modern desktop or modern server environment all of a sudden are working in the IoT world again. I was talking to another ethical hacker, another pen tester, and he made the comment that in some ways it feels like we're back hacking in the 90s. All those things we used to use are working again now. And I found the same to be true, is that as we went through these things, all of a sudden we're back using some of the same old tricks that we used to use to access desktops and servers are now working to access IoT devices. And so yes, there's been some that are less secure than others for sure. So I tend to lean towards using Metasploit, running it on either Kali Linux or ParrotSec OS, depending on the laptop I happen to grab at the time. I use them both regularly. I use them both in my own work, but also in the classroom to try to give my students exposure to this. So we use the Metasploit framework Metasploit tool to be able to push those exploits out in an easy and convenient way, a neat way that my students can understand and teach them how to do it. And so I tend to fall back on Metasploit. We also use other tools. We use Burp Suite when we're trying to do more of the web type stuff. And so we use a couple different tools depending on what we're doing, but largely Metasploit and then for system hacking. So when it comes to learning system hacking, this is where I teach system hacking. So I teach our introduction to pen testing, I teach intermediate pen testing, and we're looking at developing out a couple of additional advanced pen testing courses. So I'm always looking at what do I recommend, what do I teach? And we start with, how do we understand Linux even, right? Because a lot of our system hacking tools end up running from a Linux platform. And so I end up teaching them some basic Linux and helping them to understand Linux. But then we need to understand other things. So we need to understand how we're going to access the system. Are we going to try to crack a password? If we're going to try to crack a password, what tools are we going to use to do that? Are we going to try a brute force attack? Are we going to try dictionary attacks? Are we going to use, Hashcat to try to crack the hash? We're going to use John the Ripper to try to gain access through that way. And so we begin to talk about some of these really basic tools that work into their place in system hacking. And we begin to start with exploring those and building those out. We begin with looking at tools like nmap. How do you even begin to find the system to start with? And so then we start teaching them how to use nmap and how to do nmap scans and how to read that information and understand what an nmap scan is telling us. And nmap scripting and how does that work and what benefit does that give us in system hacking? And then eventually we build up to actually using Metasploit and using it to push, to exploit vulnerabilities and how does that look like and what does that look to escalate privileges and play through actually gaining true system access and then working both escalation and laterally through a network. But we start often with the very basic tools of understanding how do hashes work? How do passwords work? How are passwords stored? How might you gain access to those? What is a dictionary attack? And so we start with password hacking tools. We start with network discovery tools like nmap. And then we build up from there as we get into system hacking. And I've got students all the time. So I got students that come in as freshmen. They go, oh, I want to do ethical hacking. I want to do pen testing, that may have no technical background at all. And so we start with teaching them some very basic technology. You need to understand how a computer works before you can understand how to gain access to a system. How are you going to hack a system if you don't understand the operating system? How are you going to hack the system if you don't understand firewalls and networks and how they work and how you might be able to get around them? And so we spend a lot of time in those introductory courses helping them build those basic skill set of how to do this. And then we introduce them to the concepts of system hacking, and we get into helping them to understand how to gain access and what to do after they gain access. As a certified ethical hacker, I would recommend that companies that are designing systems keep security in the forefront of their mind as they're designing these systems. Security will never be foolproof. They will never develop a system that cannot be hacked given enough time and resources. But there are things that they can do by keeping security in the forefront of their minds to make it a much more robust, a much more hardened system. And so I highly recommend that they consider security as they begin their product design, as they build their products, and even after they release the products, that they continue to do their testing and continue to keep security in the forefront of their minds, because at the end of the day, we need their help in securing our systems so that we have secure systems to start with. And as new vulnerabilities are discovered, they can write the patches and help deploy them to us so we can continue to secure things. I think system selection is vital to our overall security. I've worked for a number of companies. I've come into companies that are running operating systems that are no longer supported by the vendor. There's no longer patches available. And this system selection was done for various reasons. I've worked for companies where the system selection was done because no one got around to choosing a new system, so they were still running it. But I've also worked for companies where the system selection was done because the software product that they are running on it requires that operating system, and there is no migration path forward to a supported operating system. So this is an example where system selection and system design really matters. We need to be able to keep on systems that are secure or are supportable, so we're getting those patches, because if we don't, it greatly impacts the vulnerabilities that we are accessible to. And so you start looking at some of these systems that are not patchable, or that companies are not maintaining when you select systems that don't have security at their heart. And what do you do to protect the data that you're keeping on those systems? You have handicapped your own ability to even protect the system by having a system that is either out of date and thus not securable, or that the company you chose to go with, maybe it's an IoT device and you chose to buy a cheap IoT device and the company didn't care anything about security. How are you ever going to secure that system? And so it gives the attacker, it gives that attacking agent a foothold into your network from where they then can move laterally through your network to gain access to other systems. So system selection at all levels is vital to the overall security and overall maintenance of security of your network and your data. So as we look at the best measures to prevent system hacking, I go back to really the basis that I tell my students, that I tell community events when I get an opportunity to speak to various groups around the community. And that is, we start with some really basic items, right? So one of the first things we need to do to help prevent system hacking is make sure we're applying our security patches. If we're using a supported operating system and the vendor's releasing security patches, we need to make sure we're applying those security patches. And that doesn't really matter which the operating system is: Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, Apple iOS, your IoT devices. Be sure you're applying all of those system security patches that are being released by the vendor, because if you're not, you're simply saying, hey, look, I've got a vulnerable system out here. Please come access it, to the attacker if they find it and choose to access you. So please apply patches. That's always my number one thing when we start talking about system hacking or system securing, is apply patches. It's not hard. Most vendors have made it very easy for us to be able to apply our patches. So please apply patches. Use automated patching systems to help streamline that process so that we're not having to do it all manually. But make sure those patches are applied. Number two, I say, is always make sure we're using good login credentials. Multi-factor is always a good option when it's available. If it's not, make sure we're using strong passphrases. We don't want to use, password is a horrible password, as an example, right? And so we want to make sure we're choosing good, strong passphrases, multi-word, long passwords, long passphrases. Length is important. And so patching, good passwords, good passphrases. And then we start to talk things like network segmentation. If we want to stop system hacking, we want to stop them from being able to easily move through our network. And so we start talking about how do we break up our network in ways so that systems are separated from other systems. So if we do, or when we do, because oftentimes it's not a matter of if, but when, because there are enough bad actors out there trying to access things that they probably at some point will gain access to a system on your network. How do we prevent them from running across our entire network? And so then we start talking about, network segmentation. We start talking about how do you recover. So a good countermeasure to system hacking actually is having solid backups. If we have backups, we have a restore path forward if and when a system attack happens. And then we get into much more complicated countermeasures, or at least somewhat more complicated countermeasures, and that's monitoring and how do you know when someone has accessed your system. And so, but those are my big ones, right? So if we start with patching and passwords, those are two things that anybody can do. And as a certified ethical hacker, I'm going to tell you those two will go a long ways to convincing bad actors that maybe they don't want to, maybe they want to go find an easier system. I hate to say that, but sometimes that's what we're looking for. Make sure we're not the lowest hanging fruit out there. When we all get those two things down, then we can start worrying about other things, because then we start talking network segmentation and backups and monitoring and network monitoring and all these other pieces, parts. But my strong encouragement, if we're looking for two things you can do today at the end of the day to help harden systems, help slow system attacks, patch your systems and use good password management, especially multi-factor when possible.